what I want to share with you during the coming 3 evenings, tonight and 2 further evenings, is some thoughts on what really belongs together, but I'm separating it. Theosophy as religion, as philosophy, as science. It's interesting that what is Theosophy and its uniqueness through coming at it from a variety of avenues, looking at it from various points of view. And what I would like to do is to see if we can, by attempting to understand what are the various dimensions of Theosophy, begin to see a new view of this ageless wisdom, a new perhaps to it. It has been said that according to the ancients, of course, religion, philosophy, and science were the 3 parts of essential learning. I presume that all of you are at least familiar with the Secret Doctrine to some extent. I'm not sure how many have paid much attention to the subtitle of the Secret Doctrine, because we just call it the Secret Doctrine, the SD, and so on. And if you have really paid attention to the subtitle, and I'm one, perhaps because I've been involved with publishing and so on, who becomes very much interested in everything on the title page of a book. The subtitle, of course, is a synthesis of religion, philosophy, and science. And so that is why I'm suggesting that we may be able to look at what I would call the religious dimension, the philosophical dimension, and the scientific dimension of Theosophy. So that rather than attempting perhaps a new definition of Theosophy as such, adding one more to the many definitions that have been given, that we can begin to see what are the dimensions to this great study, this worldview, this way of perceiving the universe, so that we can call it. And I'd like to just contrast, for example, and that's why I have to stand and have to have a board and so on. We can perhaps see that there are dimensions to Theosophy that need to be explored. Now, for example, I think we're all familiar with the fact that very often we have studied comparative religion. That's there in the second object of the society. Or we have seen Theosophy in its relation to science, contemporary science particularly. But have we thought of the religious dimension of Theosophy? Perhaps I should start, before I put anything on the board, by giving you what has been called a kind of definition of these terms, or at least an analogy, a metaphor that you may want to use. It has been said that science may be compared to a blind man in a dark room looking for a black cat. And philosophy is a blind man in a dark room looking for a black cat that isn't there. Religion, of course, may be compared to a blind man in a dark room looking for a black cat that isn't there, and shouting, "I have found it!" Theosophy, then, of course, may be seen as a blind man in a dark room looking for a black cat that isn't there, shouting, "I have found it," and adding let me tell you about, let me show you my pretty pussycat. So perhaps that will do as a beginning of a definition of what we are talking about in these evenings together. Well, let us suggest that there are at least 3 distinguishing characteristics of Theosophy, if we may. So that as we look at Theosophy, we can see that it has as one of its distinguishing characteristics what we will call the word. Now there are 2 aspects of that. There is first of all the word Theosophy, that is to say, its etymological significance, what it derives from, which we usually say Theosophia. But there is behind that very, very much more, for theos, of course, is derived from the verb thein, to grow, to become, to expand from within outwards, and it's cognate with Brahman and Bri in the Sanskrit, the verbal root of Brahman. So we can, but it's also, not only that, it has a potency, that is to say, it has its own inner dynamism as a word, and that's why I've put it in parentheses. To speak the word has always been of great significance. In all traditions, there has been a sacredness to words and the way in which they are spoken. So it has both its etymological significance and, as it were, its spoken, its mantric significance, if you will. There isn't time. If we had a whole week together, we might explore this in further detail. But I just throw it out for your consideration, because a whole science can be built on that very possibility. And indeed, Subbarao mentions this in his lectures on the Bhagavad Gita. You can look at it there, and so on. And HPB, of course, refers to it, and so on. So you can look at that. But we can see it as a word. Secondly, we can see it as a doctrine, which is, of course, a teaching, a specific teaching, a view. That is to say, it is not dogma, which is an opinion, but it is a teaching, which is, in the Sanskrit, a darshan, a way of perceiving everything that is in the existent world. And so it is a doctrine. And by doctrine, it simply means that it is a teaching, which is a way of looking at things. And third, a way of life, or an ethic, if you like. Now, it's interesting that we can see these, then, in terms of the dimensions of Theosophy itself. For that quality, which is Theosophy as a word, is the religious dimension. That is to say, it participates in what we can call the numinous. It participates in and has that dimension, which indeed HPB very clearly defines in the first fundamental proposition, of an ineffability, an unutterability, beyond the word, as it were, or behind the word, is its secret meaning, its inherent meaning, its unfolding. It participates then in the religious dimension. It's interesting that Carl Jung, in the foreword to Wilhelm's translation of the I Ching, has suggested that really the root meaning of religion implies careful consideration. And he says this is the original meaning of the word religio, the careful observation and taking account of the numinous. That is to say, the realm that is beyond the visible, the realm in which we participate in terms of our deepest being, One of the great Jungian psychologists, Dr. Erich Neumann, for example, has suggested that man should really be defined as homo mysticus, that at his heart, in his essence, in his very being, he is mystical. That is to say, it is beyond words, mystical from muo, to close the mouth or lips, and so on, so that one participates in a mystery, which is the religious dimension. And this, of course, is the classical etymology of the word religion. The derivation, it's interesting, the derivation that is usually given in dictionaries, even the Oxford English Dictionary, is that religion comes from religere, to tie back, to reunite. But the older meaning is really from relegere, that is to say, to approach, to consider, to view the numinous, the real, that which underlies all the transient realm of existent things. It was the church fathers, incidentally, very early on, who changed the word to meet the needs of, tying them together into the community of the church, and therefore changed the etymology of the word itself, which is rather interesting. So we can see then that this is the religious dimension. Theosophy as the word moves into the religious dimension. Theosophy as doctrine, of course, moves into the philosophical dimension, which is why I think we are interested in that. And that may seem much more easy to you, much easier to grasp. Of course, Theosophy has a philosophical dimension. It answers metaphysical questions. It deals primarily, in fact, with the central question. And it was indeed, as you probably know, in the Western world, Pythagoras who introduced the word philosophy, which is rather interesting in connection with seeing the word theosophy itself, because Pythagoras suggested that it was not then the knowing, the compilation of facts, of ideas or of opinions, but the asking of the question as one approached the numinous, the real, the underlying foundation from which all would then proceed. And to have the right answer then, one has to ask the right question. We can spend a lot of time on that very point, if you like, but that I'm going to get into more tomorrow. Theosophy then, as a way of life, is dealing with the original meaning of science. This is truly the scientific dimension in its essence, that is to say, skio, to know, to really know. And one knows because one exhibits one's knowing in one's actions. Here, one is grounded in the world of action. And so one exhibits one's religious dimension, one's philosophical dimension in one's way of life. And therefore, this is the demonstrable. And we will be talking about that much more in detail, of course, on whatever night it is. Tonight's Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday night. Days can be any days when you're on a lecture tour. So we'll be talking much more about that. Some may object and say, oh, science is hard, physical science, physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, and so on, all the other geology and anthropology and, all of these sciences. What we're talking about is what is truly a scientific mode of knowing, a scientific methodology, which ultimately comes back to its demonstrability. The very thing, indeed, that HPB herself refers to in the first point in her summing up of Volume 1, which unless you are very careful you think is thrown in sort of gratuitously, and in one way perhaps it is, because it doesn't give one, you can say, well, it doesn't focus on the fundamental principles, you see, which if you're going to have a summing up, you ought to have a summing up of principles. And it seems to be a kind of diversion from her central thesis. But what she points to there is the clear demonstrability of this whole worldview, this metaphysical position. And its demonstrability is in the one, shall I say laboratory here, or should I say laboratory? I never know whether to use American pronunciations, or British pronunciations, or what. Anyway, the one lab that is available to us, because the chief test object, if you want to put it in scientific terms, the chief test object of the entire universe and its lawfulness, its order, its design, the chief test object is man himself, each one of us. And that's what HPB points to very, very clearly. And demonstrability through generations of sages and seers who have been willing to follow a way of life, who have been willing to follow a discipline, who have been willing to test and therefore verify all of these principles, which we, we're most of us second and third hand theosophists, if I can put it that way. I'm content to read books, we all are, you see. But what we have to do is to make it a living reality. We have to demonstrate it in our lives, because our lives are the demonstration of the wisdom. What we know, as Emerson once said, what you are speaks so loudly I cannot hear the words you say, you see. And I always remember an incident many years ago when I was president of the American section, and a friend, very close friend, called me one day, and she said, do you believe in reincarnation? And I said, well, of course I do. I not only believe in it, I'm convinced of it, and so on. She said, well, why don't you act as though you did? And I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, you seem to feel you have to get everything in one life. Why don't you let a few things, over for another life, sort of thing. There are some things can be done next life, and so on. I said, well, I don't know. There probably will be some hangover. We'll probably all suffer from the dreadful hangover from this life, and what we've, a kind of intoxication of, so on. In any event, it is indeed out of this that is the genuine repeatability, demonstrability, verification of the wisdom. And it is in our lives. We are the chief test object of the universe. Now, we can see this even further. Didn't leave myself much room, but that's all right. Maybe I'll do it. Well, no. I'll continue here. We can see this even further in a most remarkable statement which HPB, in focusing on the whole cosmogonic process, in giving us the entire process of the whole expression of, manifestation of a cosmos, an ordered system, which is cosmos, which is an appearance, incidentally. I don't know if you realize, as of course Ernie has said, that I make up words. I also have a love affair with words, because I think words are extremely important. Words have great meaning to them. And of course words are metaphors for the reality that they symbolize. They are only metaphors, after all. But do you realize that the word cosmos is the same, has the same root as the word cosmetic? Have you ever thought of that? And it does. Now, what is cosmetic? It is it gives the appearance, doesn't it? So a cosmos is the appearance of that which is the unmanifest, the non-appearable. That's a nice word. I just made that one up.
I'm glad you didn't let me down.
Couldn't possibly. I think what Ernie's referring to is one of my favorite words, you see, that I think ought to be in the English dictionary, and if I keep using it often enough, maybe someday some dictionary compiler will get it there, you see. It's the fact that we don't just feel or don't just think. We combine our feeling and thinking, and so I have a nice, neat word for it. In fact, we perceive, we look at something, we perceive something, we have a reaction, we feel about it, and then we think about it. And so here is my word. I'm going to put it on in another color. You see, my word is that we perflink. So if you would like, through these evenings, you can just go on perflinking. But that's, you see, it's simultaneous we do this, isn't it? So that we perflink. Well, in this great cosmogonic process, which is the appearance, and the appearance is always, it's a cosmos because it is an appearance, but it is beautiful, you see. When you think of the word cosmetic, is not only giving an appearance, but an appearance of beauty, isn't it? I mean, isn't that why the women use cosmetics? And the men used to. I don't know why they gave up. Some of them still do, I think. But, you know, just look back in the period of, you know, Charles I in England and so on. I mean, goodness, who made up more lavishly than the men of that period, you see? And in the period of the Sun King in France and so on, isn't that right, you see? Made up lavishly, didn't they, you see? So it wasn't just left to the women. But think of it, that it is beauty. Now, it is always an approximation. And this, of course, is given very clearly in the Secret Doctrine. I'm not going to give you all the references. You can hunt them up yourself. I don't know why I should do the work for you. It's all there. But it's always an approximation to that which underlies, that which is the non-appearable, the non-manifest. And it is an approximation that is inexact, you see. It's given very clearly in stanza 4, incidentally. I'll give you that much of a clue, and you can look it up further. It's an approximation, so that everything in the manifest universe is an approximation. And it is that approximation, incidentally, which gave rise to the first noble truth of the Buddha, which is dukkha, which we usually translate as misery, suffering, which is a stupid translation, if I may say so, because any really illiterate peasant in India plowing his field didn't have to sit in meditation under the bo tree and become, I mean, it was no enlightenment for the poor peasant to know that life was misery, life is suffering. You know, you don't have to become a Buddha to know that if you're plowing the fields in India, believe me. So what was the Buddha saying? He was reminding everyone that it is dukkha, it is an approximation, it is inexact, and therefore it is unsatisfactory. And that's what dukkha really means. It's an approximation, it's unsatisfactory. But we cling to that unsatisfactoriness, you see, constantly, don't we? And so desire arises because we don't know what is really satisfactory, what will really serve us. And so, you know, we take the second best, as it were, and we cling to it and desire, and we want more of it. Because at least, you know, what do we say, better a bird in hand than two in the bush, or some, you know, we have all these interesting proverbs, which I never can quite remember, but I think it's something like that, isn't it? So that we say, well, we'll keep this in case there's nothing better that comes along. But in this whole process, the pattern that HPB presents, and it's so interesting, the pattern that she presents to us in cosmogenesis is a pattern which is revealed in anthropogenesis, which reveals itself again in us, because we are the chief test object of the universe. Have you considered that? Absolutely everything is met in the human constitution. And so she points out in discussing cosmogenesis that a fundamental principle of the esoteric philosophy establishes a triple evolutionary scheme for man. You remember that? A triple evolutionary scheme for man, which is a reflection then of the universal lawfulness proceeding in at least this tripartite dimension of the approximation of the ultimately real. It's a long sentence, but I hope you followed it. It's a threefold manifestation that is an approximation of the ultimately unspeakable, unalterable, unmanifest, which is pointed to in the first fundamental proposition. And so that triple evolutionary scheme is represented in us, she says, by the monadic or spiritual, based on, represented in, as she puts it, she says, the monadic or spiritual concerned with the growth and development into still higher phases of activity of the monad in connection with the intellectual, which must be based in the physical. And so I should have put that in green, perhaps, to have made it a bit separate. The religious, let's just do it over. How do you like that? The philosophical. Because this is really what I want to talk about, are these three. And I want you to see how indeed we are talking about the whole development. What we're talking about is really the centering of ourselves. Theosophy then, as word, as doctrine, as way of life, its religious, its philosophical, its scientific dimension, which has to do with the threefold evolution of our own being, monadic or spiritual, intellectual, and physical, as she says. And she states further, each of these three systems has its own laws. Each is represented in the constitution of man, the microcosm of the great macrocosm, and it is the union of these three streams in him which makes him the complex being he now is. And I suggest that coming back then, it's the union of these three dimensions that makes Theosophy the complex system that it is. And often then we feel there are dimensions, in fact there are indeed dimensions in this which we can explore. One never ceases that exploration, because it is not only a lifetime undertaking, but it is lifetimes undertaking to explore it fully. It seems to me that this has really never been explored in detail before, and so I wanted to set it out in that sort of overall system. Now, first of all, let us look then at Theosophy as a religion. Not as a religion, but as religion, the religious definition. You see, HPB, you'll remember early on, wrote an article, Is Theosophy a Religion? In fact, it was one of the first articles in one of the, I think, the first issue of her journal, The Theosophist. And she points out it is perhaps necessary, first of all, to say that the assertion that Theosophy is not a religion by no means excludes the fact that Theosophy is religion itself. A religion in the true and only correct sense. And she continues that thus Theosophy is not a religion, but religion itself, the one bond of unity, which is so universal and all-embracing that no man, as no speck, from gods and mortals down to animals, the blade of grass and atom, can be outside its light. Now that, of course, takes us right back then to the fact that we are dealing with a sacred dimension of ourselves. To what extent do we give this our attention, this sacred dimension of our being, this religious dimension? To what extent are we concerned then with this as a universal dimension? Because the monad, remember, when we look across the board, and this is why I think it's helpful to see this across the board in that way. When we look at that, we're dealing with a universal principle which becomes localized for purposes of expression, and indeed Atman is universal, carried by buddhi, becomes localized and focused through manas, of course, through the intellectual, which we'll be looking at tomorrow. But how much do we give attention to the fact, then, that this universal aspect must also be undergoing its own development? Now, I think in considering, then, Theosophy as religion, it may be useful to consider the religious experience. And in exploring this particular topic, so much for that one. You can continue to perflink if you like, and if you find it useful. In exploring this, I want to make reference to a couple of works that have come to my attention recently. One is by a Dominican scholar called Cosmic Origins, and it has to do with what is being suggested today in certain circles of religious thought of the return to a creation-centered tradition, particularly in Christianity, rather than what's been called the fall redemption tradition. That the author, Matthew Fox, who has done a great number of works in translating some of the mystics, some of the great mystics, including one who happens to be one of my favorite mystics, Hildegard of Bingen, a remarkable woman, most remarkable woman of the, I think, 11th century, who was really quite an incredible person. But he suggests at the very outset of his book that perhaps we need today a new religious paradigm if we are to survive. Now, we've heard a great deal in recent years about scientific paradigms, and that indeed in science, in physics particularly, a new paradigm has emerged. But we don't very much think about this in terms of that paradigm that may be necessary in religious dimensions for the survival of our planet and ourselves. So that interested me very much, because there is that remarkable statement in a most unusual letter known as the Mahachohan's letter, that the Theosophical Society was meant to be the cornerstone of the future religion of humanity. Now, what did that mean? You see, we've never really explored some of these things. We haven't given them very much thought. We read it and we set it aside, and there it is. But what does this mean? Does it mean that we need to explore what is that dimension in our own being in which we are genuinely united with all, as HPB so beautifully puts it, you see, so universal, a bond of unity which is so universal and all-embracing that nothing can be outside its light. Now, in that connection, there is another work that I have found of very real interest in pursuing this religious dimension. It's a work by a Dr. James Fowler, who is a professor of a Christian theologian, in fact, at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. Fowler became very interested in some work that was being done by a man at Harvard by the name of Lawrence Kohlberg in the development of the whole educational psychology of developing stages of moral growth. Quite interesting in itself, this concept that we go through various phases and developmental stages in moral growth. So Fowler, as a Christian theologian, went back to school, went to Harvard, and took another degree under Kohlberg in developmental psychology, and then wrote a book called Stages of Faith, the psychology of human development and the quest for meaning. Now this, of course, is the uniqueness of our human situation. We demand meaning, don't we? We demand meaning. We want to know, what does that signify? What is the meaning of that? You know, some experience comes to us. And perhaps, you know, if we can't really see the meaning, we at least, you know, we give up and we say, well, it's probably my karma. And we pass it off in that way, don't we? And as I've often said, it's all right when others come to us with all their problems and difficulties, and often we sound like a batch of parrots, you know. It's your karma, it's your karma, it's your karma. And we you know, and so we just sound like a, you know, Polly wants a cracker sort of thing, and say, you know, you just have to bear with it and that's it. Of course, when it happens to us, then we begin to say, well, I suppose it's my karma, but I really don't know what I could have done. I mean, I'm sure I was never this bad. I couldn't possibly have been. And of course, when something very pleasant and very wonderful happens to us, we say, well, we never think it's karma. Of course, well, I did everything to deserve that. Shows I'm well along on the path, and maybe this is the last life, and so on, you see. We've got it made, sort of thing. So what interested Fowler was, in terms of our quest for meaning, that there is a development in terms of faith. Just as education knows there is a development in terms of stages of growth and so on, moral growth now and so on. It's interesting, he uses the term faith rather than religion, and I think it's very useful for our purpose. It is the usual translation of a Sanskrit word which is really non-translatable, shraddha, which has often been called faith or trust, that we all have, whether we like it or not, whether we will or not. Not only, it's not a belief, but we all have a meaning system, you see. And this meaning system undergoes changes in very definite stages, very definite ways. Everyone is embedded in some faith. And sometimes, if I may be so blunt, I'm sure no one, I'm not referring to anyone here in Edmonton Lodge, you understand, but only to people south of the border, you know, you see. Do that way, you see. So you can feel very superior here in Edmonton Lodge. But south of the border, there are some who simply substitute Theosophy for a kind of other meaning system. So I think we have, you know, if I can put it rather bluntly, we have Presbyterian Theosophists, we have Mormon Theosophists, and Vaishnavite Theosophists, and you know, and so on, where we have merely substituted, but we have not grown. We're embedded in a worldview. Now, if we are really embedded in the Theosophical worldview, this leads to a meaning system in which we ourselves are experiencing our own religious dimension. May I put it that way, do you see? And so he suggests that, Fowler is suggesting, we never lose faith or shraddha. And this, of course, becomes the very first, incidentally, in the whole Buddhist, particularly Mahayana Buddhist tradition. The first requirement is shraddha. It is a kind of, there is an implicit trust in the system, the meaningfulness of life itself, and therefore one grows in it. Now, Fowler suggests that there is a transition from one stage to another which is sometimes painful. And indeed, what I often say to audiences, I'll try not to make it too painful for you here, but I often say, I think unless we really suffer some pain in the discovery of deeper levels of the Theosophical worldview, we haven't done very much. We've sort of gone along on the surface. I think we should probe, question, explore, inquire. You see, this HPB referred to it, and all of our later leaders have referred to it. Sri Ram used to refer to it so very, very often. That do we really inquire? Do we really probe? Or do we simply stay at one level and say, yes, I know? The kind of person who borrows the Secret Doctrine from a beautiful library like this, and after 1 month returns it and says, what do I read next? Sort of thing, you see, which has been known to happen, believe it or not. Do we really probe? Do we inquire? So the transition can be sometimes painful, sometimes lengthy, sometimes abortive. A kind of death may be involved. And we don't like that. I'm not talking about physical death. That's the easiest kind. That's the simplest kind, is the ending of an incarnation. But the whole death-rebirth phenomenon, which is implied, you remember one of the statements that HPB makes at in the proem of the Secret Doctrine is that the pivotal doctrine of the esoteric philosophy admits no special privileges in man save those won by his own effort and merit throughout a long series of metempsychoses and reincarnations. Now, she uses the two terms. And why? Because reincarnation is the simplest way, in one sense. I mean, just one life after another sort of thing. Ad nauseam ad infinitum, if you like. The tough thing is the metempsychosis, the transformation of the interior being, which moves now in a new direction. You see, that's the toughie. But she uses the word. She doesn't do much with it. She uses it. She refers to it here and there. She gives us hints, and you have to be really alert to catch those hints, I think, that what we're dealing with is a total transformation of consciousness. So, there may be periods of disequilibrium when we move from one structure of faith to another, and none of us are very content with that kind of disequilibrium. Well, my goodness, time is going. And I was going to leave you some time to talk, or to ask me questions. Well, I still have some time, haven't I? Yes. Fowler identifies 7 stages, and I thought it's rather interesting to note these as stages in which we are growing in our meaning system. And this, to me, it has a very direct bearing, as you will see, on the religious dimension of the Theosophical worldview. He calls the first stage a primal faith. And he says of this that it is a kind of pre-language disposition of trust, a genuine trust, which forms, of course, generally in infancy then, and it marks the earliest stages of our relationships with each other. It's a trust that offsets the anxiety that results from all the separations that occur throughout our life. It's a kind of primal faith. It can be equated with a period of infancy, but also by analogy, and remember, analogy is extremely important. By analogy, it can be equated then with that infancy in our theosophical career, if you like, where there's a kind of primal faith that we take things, we accept things as they are given, as they're given. And perhaps you're now accepting things as I'm saying them. But I want you to inquire, to look at it, to try to probe it. The second stage, he calls...
Did you use the black?
Yes, I can certainly use the black. All right. 1. Primal. The second he calls the intuitive projective. He uses some big words, and that's why I thought it's helpful if I put them down. You know, every scholar, the moment they get PhDs and so on, they begin to use big words, you know, which is fun at times too, and they are descriptive. And by this he means, and of course he equates it often with early childhood, but again, you can, by analogy, see this development in yourself. Imagination is now stimulated by stories, by myths, and notice how much HPB uses of stories and myths and so on. Am I doing the wrong thing?
No, I gotta change my tape. Sorry.
Oh, I see. Oh, yes, of course. I heard something click and wondered what was happening. Yes. Symbols, gestures, and so on, all of this, where in this stage one begins to sense the awesomeness of the world. One begins to sense, if you like, the awesomeness of the whole theosophical philosophy. And there are a lot of people, I must say, who give up at this stage of theosophy. You know, it's too big for me. Maybe another life. It's just too much. I can't take it all in, sort of thing, you know. We go through that, don't we, you see. And but at this stage, logical thinking is not yet awakened, and so there are images developed. It's intuitive and yet projective, and we put it into an imagery, and we see it in the rich imagery of life itself. The third phase he calls the mythic literal. Interesting terms. Mythic literal. And it extends, of course, from childhood onwards in terms of age levels, and as some people may remain at this stage for their whole lives, stay at this third stage. It's characterized sort of by as a time when one learns the rules of the game, so to speak. One abides by the rules as they've been set out. One behaves in a certain way, as it were. There's a need for order, you see. And so we have our lodges and our study centers and so on, and we sort of fall into the patterns, you see. We know what it means to be a good theosophist, which means, you know, never upset anybody, never disturb the status quo, you know, don't, you know, bring in things like, well, maybe there are times, you see, suddenly, let me give you an illustration. My assistant director at the Crotona School has been leading the study circle in the Key to Theosophy, and she was spending a good deal of time on the section dealing with karma. And of course she came on and she suddenly had really not thought of it before. And often, you know, unless you lead a class, you don't think of some of the things that are said in the books. I mean, it's easy to pass over them. But when you lead a class, you suddenly have to, you know, either expurgate the book, you know, and glue two pages together and omit something, you see, or you have to face up to what it says. And suddenly she was reading and she said, my gosh, it talks about unmerited karma. Now, that's So I said, had you ever considered that maybe there is no such thing as individual karma? There's only group, universal. Karma is a law, and it really doesn't matter which one of us gets hit on the head, because there's no such thing as an other. All is one. We are all one. We say it all the time. Unity. We are all one. There is only one. So maybe it's just one karma. And we just happen to be where the brick falls. And it really doesn't much matter. Well, I mean, maybe that's carrying it too far, but, it sort of threw her, you see. I like to put spokes in people's wheels. I haven't been expelled from the society yet. Maybe one of these days I will be for coming up with some radical ideas. Because everything at this stage is generally taken literally, you see. Karma is tit for tat, You did this in your last life, and by golly, you're going to suffer in this life, and so on. And it's a tit for tat game, And there are the recorders scribbling it in a book, you see. And there it is, and so on. And, and it's taken very literally, And there is your page. When your page comes up, that's it. Well, there are a lot of people who stay at that, but there are also a lot who move on to what has been called, and here he gets really, wordy, a synthetic conventional faith. That nice mouthful. We haven't reached the end. We're only at number 4, you see. When new cognitive abilities, we begin to think through things for ourselves. And so we begin to see things in a new perspective. We have to now reintegrate what we have seen in a literal way into new meaning. We have to integrate all of these statements. And this isn't always easy, because there are contradictory statements. I've often said in studying the Secret Doctrine, one has to be patient with paradox and ambiguity. One has to tolerate paradox. And this should be very easy for us. Niels Bohr, one of the great physicists of the 20th century, the father of quantum physics, said one time that the opposite of a great truth is not a falsehood. The opposite of a great truth is another great truth. Ernie referred to the fact that I was in Japan it was some months ago now, and meeting with our members in Japan, and 2 of them are busily translating the Secret Doctrine into Japanese. No easy task, because Japanese is an ideographic language, you see. And they pointed up to me some of the so-called contradictions in HPB's writing. And they say, look, on page 101 she says this, and on page 326 she says that. And how are we going to translate this? How do we resolve this dilemma, you see? Well, it's at this stage one begins to recognize paradox for what it is. That 2 things can be true, even though seemingly in contradiction. So we begin to integrate. It's at this stage that a strong sense of commitment to life itself begins to take place. That one begins to accept the ambiguities of life, the paradoxes of existence. So that there is a sense that now one of the things at this stage is that external authority is still accepted, and one is content with a kind of group consciousness one shares, and so there is indeed a kind of still external authority, And we go around, you know, a lot of us. I do it myself. HPB says, Annie Besant says, D. Peruker says, and so on, all of these, you see. And we sort of bolster it by an external authority. We have not moved very much beyond this stage. I think, in one sense, many theosophists, if I can say, isn't that dreadful of me, are at those two stages. But I'm excluding Edmonton Lodge and members of, you know, Mercury Lodge and so on. I mean, all of Edmonton members, not in that. Undoubtedly, you have at least moved to the fifth stage, which he calls, and here we get really tough, the individuative reflective. And it is this that I think we have to move to. Here one really reflects upon, critically evaluates one's beliefs and one's values. One understands oneself and others as part of a total system. But now there is responsibility for my own choices, responsibility for what I think, for what I believe, for my faith, for my trust. I am responsible. And this involves a very real shift. And it's always interesting, you know, that the fourth in any series of 7, as you well know, is the turning point, isn't it? Here we have to move to an innate authority. There is no other authority. Here we're still content with the external authority. And this is painful. This shift is indeed painful. But it is a necessary shift. A truly internal authority arises so that one distances oneself from previous assumptions. It involves often a rejection of ritual, saying, oh, that's silly, that's ridiculous, that's back in the mythic literal, you know, and so on. And when we really reject it, there's a rejection of all external authority and a kind of inner reliance. It's a lonely stage, a necessary stage, and I think to the genuine theosophist, this is what indeed HPB pointed to, the independent explorer in the realm of truth, the solitary thinker, the one willing to engage himself in this enterprise. And that is a trust, a genuine faith that one must develop. It's important then to note, however, that that Fowler posits 2 further stages. And it's interesting, Fowler says he really has to posit these, he has to suggest them, and I think that it's these 2 stages, however, that Theosophy, in its religious dimension, points to the need to go even beyond this. Here is where, indeed, the truly religious dimension of Theosophy comes into play. The third he calls the sixth he calls conjunctive faith. Conjunctive faith. And he says it involves now an integration, a full integration of the logic of rational certainty, which has come here at the third, the logic of rational certainty with the logic of conviction, the full acceptance of paradox, the recognition that truth is indeed multidimensional. And that, I think, we have to realize. Truth is multidimensional. There is no one expression of truth that is narrow and obligatory for everyone. Truth is multidimensional. And I think we have to move to this. There is then, at this stage, the unity of mind and experience, a movement that is from Kama Manas to Buddhi Manas, if you like, and where now the ritual that has been seen to be thrown out here is now recognized as indeed valid, that the whole cosmogonic process is an elaborate ritual, and that we reflect this in our lives. Ritual now has new significance. It's not repetition, but it is every ritual that is performed is the recreation of the universe. The Masonic ritual, church rituals, all the rituals of the mystery schools, indeed. These are the recreation of the universe, and we can engage in that. And it takes indeed the deeper meaning of ritual, which we so often throw out and say it has no significance. But here we recognize the depth of significance. One embraces at this point the polarities of existence. Symbol and story, metaphor and myth are now appreciated as genuine vehicles for grasping truth. And it's interesting that in recent years there has come again into the Western world, which has been so long dominated by science and by mechanistic science, a kind of hunger for storytelling, for myth-making. And the ancient myths are being revived. And we are finding in those myths the genuine history of the soul. This is indeed that religious dimension. And notice the number of myths to which H.P.B. points in the Secret Doctrine. Meaningful, because what they're hinting at, what she's hinting at, and what they hint at, is that this is the only way in which there is awakened that interior mystical knowing of ourselves. Well, Fowler points to a seventh stage, a final stage, as he suggests, and I think this is indeed the progress, which is the full religious dimension, the fullness of the religious dimension. He calls it a universalizing faith. And this indeed is that full dimension, as he puts it, in this conjunctive stage, one has opened oneself, but one still hangs on to the self. Now, in the seventh stage, the individual moves beyond that to a total loss of the sense of I. Ahamkara is no longer. This stage involves an overcoming of paradox through the moral and aesthetic actualizations of being. It's a stage then beyond paradox, beyond polarities, when the individual is grounded in the oneness with the power of being. One is heedless of self-preservation, because one's visions, one's commitments, free one for a passionate and yet detached spending of the self in genuine love, in compassion. It is this vision which Fowler posits, which is certainly the vision which is given to us of the Bodhisattva path, the vision of the Buddha, in which we are that. That, it seems to me, is indeed the religious dimension, the fullness of the religious dimension, which is open to us, which we can take, we can find ourselves, we can locate and say, well, I really must push myself beyond this stage, beyond the stage of just accepting literally, beyond the stage of seeing the dichotomy, the contradictions. I must constantly explore and deepen and develop that kind of shraddha, that kind of faith, that kind of trust, which moves beyond all separateness to the realization, the actualization of the oneness of all existence. And I think that, if I may say so, is what we are after. Well, I wanted to leave some time for discussion. There's much more one could say, but there you may have questions and things you would like to ask. So I'll leave it at that point.
Let me make a comment here, George.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me for the 2 weeks when we were at the European School of Theosophy, we weren't looking for consensus on any individual discussion, but it seems to me that after the 2 weeks we did come to a consensus, and the consensus seems to point to synthetic connections,
Mm-hmm.
where Adam was pointing to the fact that in order to actually get involved, we have to become the doer or the activator of lecturers,
Mm-hmm.
speakers. You have to go out there and do it and not just sit back and listen.
That's right. Absolutely.
And I
Yes.
think that fits in very well.
Fits
with
in
what you're
perfectly
describing,
with what I'm trying to
to
describe.
jump from the synthetic connection to the individual.
The individual.
Reflective.
Uh-huh. Yes. And that can be painful. This movement is not an easy movement. Not at all an easy movement. So I'll put it in red because sometimes with our heart's blood, you know. Yes.
I find the going from the number 5, individuative reflective,
Mm-hmm.
to what you said that conjunctive
Mm-hmm.
is.
Mm-hmm.
I find that hard because you said that I think, if I remember well, you said that in individuative reflective, that's when one becomes independent.
Mm-hmm. When now recognizing it in internal, but at this stage there's often a rejection of myth, of ritual, of symbol, and so on.
Authority.
Because one feels that's outside, you see.
Right.
And so it often involves a rejection of that. As one moves, shifts the center of authority from outside to inside.
Exactly. So
Mhm.
then you said that in conjunctive, then a person finds that ritual
Is meaningful.
is meaningful.
Mm-hmm.
But ritual doesn't. Are you talking about like ritual in a particular
Any ritual.
denomination?
No, any
church?
ritual. Any ritual.
So then it's meaningful, but it doesn't mean that one has to go back to it and accept
One
it.
never goes back. One
That's
always.
the part that I was.
No, one never goes back. But now one sees in ritual the depth of its meaning. You see, all the great mystery schools had rituals. But we often throw out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak, you see. So it's not a return to, but it is now a recognition of what is genuine ritual. What is the genuineness in ritual, too, for example.
And what is it?
That now it's participation in the recreation of the universe, actually.
I see. But one is beyond that, like a ritual.
But it doesn't mean-
to a particular church or.
Probably not. One may go to a particular church and now brings to it a new meaning. The Catholic Church, for example, the symbolism. You see, there's a marvelous essay by Carl Jung in his work, The Transformation Symbolism in the Mass. The Catholic Mass has tremendous potency in it. This isn't to say that every Catholic understands it by any means, but it has tremendous potency in it. And it is the transformation symbolism is phenomenal. And so one sees the ritual now in a new way. And that's why I mentioned the Catholic. The Masonic ritual is exactly the same, the rituals of Freemasonry. Now one sees them for their meaningfulness, for their depth. All too often the Masonic order, the masculine order, has become just a social club or a club of status and so on, to meet businessmen and so on. But one begins to see that the Masonic ritual is indeed a very ancient, predates the medieval guilds and so on from which it's said to have arisen, but really goes back to the Egyptian mysteries. So that it now one enters
by
into
ritual here, you don't necessarily mean to categorize it as
No.
ceremonial ritual.
No, not
You're also
necessarily.
talking about
Natural rituals.
daily chores.
Daily chores are done. Very often daily chores are done in a way. How do we, for example, how do we put a postage stamp on a letter? That can be a deeply meaning ritual. It can be. Or do we just slap them on any old way? You see. It's interesting because we begin to...
Japanese, for example,
Yes.
are very embedded in ritual.
They
Everything
are.
do
Every day, yes.
The English are very ritualistic
Yes,
as well when it
yes.
comes to their making of their tea.
Of course, of course. But it becomes a meaningful thing. The tea ceremony in Japan is
It's almost meditative.
it becomes a meditation.
Meditation
Yes.
state in this.
And we've lost a lot of that, you see. We've lost the aesthetic dimension of meditation because we've been so focused in left brain meditation that we have forgotten that meditation is really a right brain activity and a whole brain activity. And there is an aesthetic dimension.
I was just reading recently about bonsai.
Mm-hmm.
Japanese
Yes, bonsai.
that
Mm-hmm.
To a Buddhist who grows bonsai, that
Mhm.
bonsai is actually a religious,
It is.
precious object.
Yes.
Taking care of it is a
Mhm.
meditative
Mhm.
ritual
That's right. Mm-hmm.
in
to-
which that person feels in harmony with the universe,
Mhm.
in harmony with
That's right. Yes. Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
There you get a jump in consciousness again, where
Mhm.
you describe pride in what you
Mhm.
do, and then, pride in,
Yes.
in
Mhm.
everyday things.
Yes. Mhm.
Very materialistic.
That's
pride.
right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So in one sense, if HPB is talking about pride, taking
Mhm.
pride into what you do,
Mm-hmm.
she's probably talking about the ritual aspect.
The ritual
And
aspect.
the pride
Yes.
to take care of
Yes. To do what you do properly. Do what you do properly. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we don't take care, you see. We don't pay attention, you see. And this is the whole thing, that we give attention. And isn't this the whole basis, really, of meditation?
In that context, it's not so important what you do as it is
How you do it.
That's
Yes,
spiritual.
that's right. Yes.
You could be
yes.
doing almost anything.
Mm-hmm. 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 I didn't mean to silence everybody. I expected some objections to what I might have. But it does seem to me that this is a very helpful schemata, at least, and take it only as a schemata, not as a, hard and fast. But it helps to open up these other dimensions, doesn't it?
When you talk about the painfulness of going from, say, the
Mhm.
number 4 onwards,
Mm-hmm.
would you describe that painfulness as an emotional painfulness?
Sometimes it is.
Or
Sometimes
just
it's
talk
sometimes it's a kind of mental anguish, One becomes, we become very possessive of our particular point of view, our particular faith, as if I can put it that way, our particular meaning system. And something comes in to disturb it. And there is a kind of anxiety, don't confuse me with the facts, my mind's made up sort of thing. It's more than a mental, but there can be a kind of anxiety, a kind of anguish. Do we really want to probe? Do we really want to inquire, you see? Do we really, as we'll point out on Thursday in discussing the scientific dimension, do we really want to live a way of life? You see, in my estimation, and again, it's only in my estimation, but I think it's clearly set forth in the Secret Doctrine. HPB makes a rather clear statement. If you would come to the wisdom, you must live the life. Live the life if you would come to the wisdom. Now, we're content with the knowledge. We're content with the sort of facts, with the surface. But do we really want to come to Sophos, to Sophia, to the wisdom? Do we really want to? I spoke of transformation, the metamorphosis of consciousness. One of the most remarkable works that has ever been written that really portrays the as much as could be, some of the mystery tradition in the mysteries of the Eleusinian mysteries, the Orphic mysteries, the mysteries of Isis and Osiris, is that 2nd century work by Lucius Apuleius, which has been translated as the Golden Ass, or it's known as, in the translation, the Golden Ass, or the Metamorphoses of Lucius Apuleius. And it's, of course, the modern translation is by Robert Graves. That's probably the easiest one to get. But what happens, you see, is that very briefly, Lucius, the hero of the story, whose name means light, quite obviously, Lucius, from Lux, light, is on his way home. He's going to his mother's home, which was Thessaly, which was, it was said, the place of witchcraft and so on, a feminine place. But what does it symbolize? It symbolizes Sophia, Sophos, wisdom, his mother's home. That's where he's nurtured. But he's returning there, the prodigal son returning. Goes through all sorts of dreadful experiences, and the very first one of which occurs very shortly after he is set out on his journey. I can't give you the whole story, time doesn't permit. But very soon after he sets out on his journey, he comes to a home where the lady of the house, whose name is Pamphila, which is interesting, which means loving everything, is very much versed in the occult arts. She's expert in the occult arts. But she has a servant, a kitchen maid, which means somebody who really doesn't quite know what she's doing, whose name is Photis. A marvelous name. So we have it in photography and so on, which is reflected light, which is the astral plane, if you like, or, you know, it's the reflected light, you see, and not the true light of Lucius. But he's beguiled by her. We always fall in love with the glamorous and the bedazzling, and my Lord, in this, you know, market today of what I call the spiritual junk food that's out there, you know, that, you know, sort of, you know, heat it up in 10 minutes and you've achieved enlightenment, you see. It's a spiritual junk food market. It's a smorgasbord of spiritual junk food that's out there, you see. How many people are falling in love with Photis today, you see? And what happens? Photis says, I can do anything my mistress can do. I can give you the ointment. I can give you this that will, you know, give you these powers. But, of course, she makes a mistake. And what happens? He has an ass's head. And all he can do is hee-haw. And my gosh, that's what's happening on this spiritual junk food market. Look at the people walking around with asses' heads. As a result, you say, making asses of themselves, as we say, because they thought they would achieve enlightenment in, you know, for $3,000 in 10 easy lessons, or one weekend, be a channel, you know, be my guest, sort of thing. So what happens? And then he is told that the only way he can resume his human form is to eat roses. And what is the rose? You see, the symbol of self-sacrifice, the symbol of really compassion but self-sacrifice. And there are the thorns on the roses. One eats the thorns too, as it were. That is to say, one has to suffer. We suffer what we, you know, but that's where you see the metamorphosis. Now, let's hope none of us go around with asses' heads, but there can still be a painfulness, a certain loss is suffered, a certain anxiety, you know, if we really mean business, you see. We're hesitant. We want to know what's going to happen to me if I do this. So we're hesitant. We don't have Shraddha. We don't have that carries us on to the next step. Because we want to know if, you know, will I get there this life, or, you know, is it going to be easy or painful? Do I have to give up this or give up that? You know, I'd like to just hang on to this little bit, you see. And the last fetter is indeed that sense of I.
I think, too, we have been conditioned to accept guarantees or to look
Yes.
for guarantees.
Yes, that's right. Yes, so we have, you see. And maybe there's no guarantee at all. What about that? Are we willing to risk all, you see? You know, in one of the Mahatma letters, we play a risky game and the stakes are human souls. And that was from one who was willing to risk everything. But, you know, we're not. So that's why I say we remain second-hand, third-hand theosophists, sort of. You know, hand-me-downs. We were the hand-me-downs of the brave ones who were willing to ascend the heights. Yes.
On number 7, where
Mhm.
you're saying that we move to the total loss of the sense of I,
Mm-hmm.
how do you explain that, well, a lot of the thinking is that I am God and I am this and I am
Mhm.
that. Is that what we're supposed to be losing and we become part of the whole?
You see, it seems to me what is pointed at is very clearly set forth in this universalizing, very clearly set forth in the voice of the silence, where he becomes a pillar, a white pillar facing the west, and then the sun's most glorious rays will shine, and so just a presence that is there, the Bodhisattva path, which is pointed to in the voice of the silence. So there's not, you know, I am God, or which is the emphasis on I am, you see, but rather the present, God is, the presence is, which is the Buddha. And so it's said that at his enlightenment all nature rejoiced and all creation took a step forward. And that's the path that's been outlined for us, not an easy way. You know, nobody promised us a bed of roses, as it were. No one ever said it would be easy. But, you know, I mean, and sometimes we want to bow out and, you know, and say, well, Theosophy isn't for me in this lifetime. It's too tough and too rigorous and so on. But it's joyous, too. It's the greatest adventure in the world. It's a tremendous adventure. And that's why I say in this aesthetic mode, for example, meditation as art, or art as meditation, one does become forgetful of the self, you see. When you are really in that, there is no self, is there? You simply forget the self. You do. If you've ever painted a picture or written a poem or you know, engaged in anything which absorbed you, you see. And we've lost that art of the joyousness of just giving ourselves and not hanging on, just being there, being in the color of the paint, being in nature. Not observing nature, but being in the tree, being in the sunset, being in the music. And then, you see, one never asks the question, does one give up the self? The self is non-existent at that moment. But we've lost a lot of that. And that's the joyousness of it. So it's painful, but it's also joyous.
I think when you were talking about rituals in Christianity, the greatest ritual that symbolizes that letting go of the self and the joy of it and the pain of it is the crucifixion and resurrection.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes.
It always seemed to me that that's really what
Mm-hmm.
it's about.
That's right.
Not a
Mm-hmm.
physical death.
Not a physical death at all. No. Not at all. Mm-mm.
Okay, any question now? If there are no more questions, stop it there tonight. I've got a guest book that I'd like everybody to sign, if you may. We keep it on a register, and we always have a little guest book of who attended and who didn't. Tomorrow night, Joy will be continuing with the second part of the lecture, and then on Thursday will be the third part, the conclusive part. So if you can be attentive and hopefully not get lost.
7:30. We should have been here. Sorry about that.
I'll start with you here and you can pass it.